Hey, you're the only one on here so far.
I can hear you through the webinar right now, just so you know.
Okay. If anyone else comes on, I'll just mute. But it gives me a button to start broadcasting. So that's why, I think I'm going to hit that here in like a minute or two, and then I'm recording this to the cloud. So, yeah. But just text me or whatever if anything seems kind of messed up.
Absolutely will.
And then you're a panelist, so I guess if anyone, I think I just put you on there for fun. So I don't know if your experience is different than like an attendee or not.
I don't know. I can unmute. I can start my video if I want to. I can share.
Oh, that's why. Okay. So yeah. So if somebody shoots me through my window, you can jump in and take over. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to hit broadcast here in at 11:59, and then we'll go from there.
All right. Good luck.
Thank you. Bye. All right. Good morning, everybody. This is Bob Randall, and we'll start our webinar here very shortly. It's about 12 o'clock right now. I think we'll wait till 12:01 and get things kicked off to make sure we take advantage of everybody's time today. As we kind of softly get started here, I want to welcome those of you that have joined us and introduce myself. I'm Bob Randall. I am a professor at the College of St. Scholastica in their MBA Leadership and Change program here in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, and I'm also CEO of Transcend Engagement. We provide employee engagement technology and consulting to clients. I also spent 25 years in the corporate environment and have done a fair bit of research on this topic of millennials in the workplace. So we'll get started here, and I also want to let you know that we are recording this as well. So if you happen to drop out or have to run to a meeting or come in late, we'll have the recording available to people at a later date, and we'll have an email follow-up for you to be able to tap into that. So if you have any questions, you're welcome to use the chat box that should be available to you for that. And then we'll also have time at the end of the webinar for questions. If you have any technical difficulties, it's pretty rare, but if it happens, we would recommend that you just re-log in, and that should work. And we'll kind of get started here. So I've got about 25 minutes of content for you today. So again, thanks for joining us. We're going to cover a little bit on just generational research, the different generations that are currently in the workplace today, the specific needs that millennials, that we've identified that millennials have, the drivers of engagement for workers as a whole, and then hopefully some action planning and what you might be able to do to help attract and retain millennials in the workplace. So the first thing I thought would be good to start with is just kind of generations, through the generations. So I'm sure we've always heard the, oh, back in my day type of comment that often gets said by the older generation about younger generations. And that has happened throughout time. So whether we're talking back in the early 1900s, people were complaining about the younger generations back then. And certainly we hear a lot of that happening today. Again, it's very common, but generational differences just by nature cause friction and misunderstanding. And they can also sometimes be overblown, and they can help stereotype different generations. So I remember, when I was a 20-something in the workplace, I remember being told many times that I was too impatient. You want everything at once. Your generation has no loyalty. Again, that's something that has happened over the generations. And I'm a Gen Xer. I'm in my late 40s. So I even remember that happening to me quite some time ago. And I see it happening in today's workforce today as people talk about the younger generation, the millennials coming into the workplace. So it's common, it happens. And I hope today that we can maybe clear up some misunderstandings, create some understanding, and then what we can do in the workplace to hopefully do a better job of retaining and meeting the needs of millennials. So what we're talking about today is based on generational research. It's not just pop culture or pop research or anything like that. This is a social science that studies the behaviors and attitudes of various age groups. And there are really two things that we put into the buckets when it comes to the behaviors and attitudes of millennials or any generation. And the first thing is where they're at in their life cycle. So because millennials are younger, they're in their 20s and early 30s, they're at a certain state of their life cycle that everybody at those points in their lives have certain attitudes and behaviors that are unique to them. So again, I kind of go back to my own example of you're impatient, you're too young, you want everything at once. That's a commonality of people who are in their 20s and 30s, no matter whether you're a Gen Xer, a millennial, a baby boomer, or a traditionalist. Everybody generally, when they're younger like that, have those types of behaviors and attitudes. But there are certain behaviors and attitudes that are unique to different generations. And those are what we're going to be really focused on today when it comes to millennials. And those attitudes and behaviors are shaped by the way different generations are raised by their parents, and different things that are happening in society that help shape those behaviors and attitudes. So we're going to talk a little bit about those. So why do we categorize people by generation? So again, this is done by social scientists using both quantitative and qualitative data. So social scientists will use surveys, they'll use focus groups, and they'll help try to create themes out of the different behaviors and attitudes that emerge from different generations in our population. And many of those attitudes and behaviors are common. So those are the things that we're really going to focus on today. And what they do is they help us better understand the needs of different generations. And so one thing I want everyone to remember is that we're generalizing these themes, we're generalizing these attitudes and behaviors, and not every person shares those attitudes and behaviors. But what we can say is that, in general, those behaviors tend to exist more so with millennials or with baby boomers or whatnot. So but just to kind of remember, in the end, people have their own unique needs, but when they overlap, we can use this generational data to better understand different attitudes and behaviors within different segments of our population. So why do we need to pay attention to these millennials? Well, they make up in the US almost 50% of our workforce today. And unfortunately, they're the least engaged generation in our workforce today. So they're, according to Gallup, only 29% of millennials are fully engaged at work, compared to 34% of the overall workforce. So they are the least engaged when we look at it by segment. And they're also the most likely to change jobs. So again, this data is from various sources, but they're more likely to have a new job in the past, 3 times more likely in the past year to have a new job. They're 10% more likely to say they will not be at their current job within the next 12 months than other generations would say. And they're more open to new opportunities than other generations as well. So we'll talk a little bit about why that might be happening and what organizations can do to help mitigate that. So the generations that are in the workforce today predominantly are baby boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials. And you might also hear millennials referred to as Gen Y. But today, for the most part, we'll be talking about them as millennials. Just different social scientists have different names for things. But of course, baby boomers are the older generation in the workforce. Their percentage of the workforce is declining because over 10,000 of them are retiring each day. And their attitudes and behaviors were shaped primarily by the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and Woodstock. So they're very much of like a protest generation. They're also sometimes called the hippie generation. And that has helped shape their behaviors and attitudes. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth when it comes to that because our focus today is on millennials. But you can see Gen Xers are kind of sandwiched in the middle when it comes to where they fall. And they make up just over 1/3 of the workforce today. And their attitudes and behaviors were very much shaped by being what we call latchkey kids. And that was kind of a new phenomenon for Gen Xers, where kids would get home from school and they would be kind of left to their own devices to kind of figure out how to entertain themselves, maybe to go find a place to study, maybe to get their own snacks, that type of thing, because they might have had a parent, maybe both parents were working, or maybe they came from broken families or one-parent families. So their attitudes and behaviors were very much shaped by those types of experiences. And then millennials, of course, were born generally between 1981 and 1996. I mentioned earlier they make up almost 50% of the workforce. They're expected to make up around 50% of the workforce by 2020, so just in the next year or so. And they're much more diverse than previous generations. They're much more likely to be single. So they're not getting married at the same rate as previous generations. And some of their attitudes and behaviors are really shaped because their parents treated them more as partners rather than being authoritarian figures to them. They're also very much shaped by the Great Recession, school shootings, student debt. Those are the things that are kind of ingrained into that generation's mind that are unique to them. And we'll talk about how that's driving some of their attitudes and behaviors. So some of the general attitudes and behaviors of millennials can kind of be thrown into these different buckets. So I kind of mentioned they're very tech savvy. So the millennials are kind of the first generation to grow up with technology. They use social media for social connections versus the older generations that use technology more for productivity tools, where millennials are using them to actually create online presence, to create their own personality online, which is very different from the older generations. They're more into mobile, wearables, technology, all places, everywhere, all the time. They're also very curious. So this is kind of the generation that says, give me time and freedom to innovate. They're very interested, they're open to learning, they want to know new things. And we'll talk about how that plays out in the workplace, where they tend to resist like repetitive jobs. They want to be able to continue to learn and grow. They're also quite risk averse. I mentioned earlier, they're very saddled with student debt. They're somewhat shell-shocked by the Great Recession. Many of them came into the workforce in 2007, 8, 9, 10, and 11, when there were very, very few jobs available. So you can imagine graduating from college or community college with a fair amount of debt, more so than other generations by far. And then they come into a workforce right away that has very few jobs available. Of course, that's changed over the last few years, but they're still somewhat scarred by that experience. So they are risk averse, partly for that reason. They're also very collaborative. They were taught in school more so in teams than previous generations were. And they were always kind of promoted the team approach, whether that's to schoolwork, to extracurricular activities, those types of things. So they kind of had this team attitude that was fostered from day one, and that's something that they really expect in the workforce today as well. So let's just kind of talk a little bit about what millennials are not. And again, these are generalizations. So in a general sense, millennials are not lazy. Sometimes we hear that as a complaint, but if you kind of think back to previous generations, every older generation thinks the younger generation is lazy, they want something for nothing, that type of thing. But when we look at the attitudes and behaviors of millennials as a group, they're really quite competitive. They like setting goals, they like to celebrate successes, they like being recognized for achievements. So they have actually quite an innate desire as a group to succeed. They're also not disloyal. So oftentimes we hear, and I did show data earlier showing that they are job hoppers to some degree, or they're looking for a better fit oftentimes than what they're finding in their current positions. So they are out looking for better opportunities or a better fit. But every younger generation has job hopped more than older generations. So when we actually look at the data, we can say that millennials do not job hop any more than Gen Xers did at the same age. So, so we just have to know that all younger generations are always kind of initially, maybe in their first, second, third, fourth jobs, never quite finding exactly the right fit, but eventually they're very likely to settle into a position that's a good fit for them, and then they will stay at that point. So they're no more disloyal or more job hoppers than at least Gen Xers were at the same age. So kind of ultimately, what do millennials want? Well, we put through the research that I've done, put this into like 6 different categories. So I'm going to dive into each of these in much more detail, one by one. So flexible workplace, they want flexibility. What does that mean? They want the ability, not all the time, but sometimes to be able to work from home. Certainly they know that technology enables a lot of work to be done at home, maybe not every position in the world, but more so than in the past. And so they want to have more remote working opportunities, and they want to be able to have flexible hours. That doesn't mean that they don't want to show up to work and have social connections at work. That just means that they don't like to be boxed in for no apparent reason. So if the job says be here from 9 to 5, we don't care if you have meetings or not. And we know that you can do your job just equally as well at home or from a different site. They don't get that, and they don't like being told black and white rules when there's not what they don't view as a good reason behind it. So we always have to kind of remember to explain the why, and then where we can, if we want to meet the needs of millennials, make sure that we have, a flexible workplace that works on behalf of the organization, but also on behalf of the workers as well. Also have on here self-managed work designs. I'm going to go into that in a little more detail, but essentially what I mean by that is giving the millennials goals to accomplish, ways to do their job, but then just giving them some degrees of freedom to get it done. And then customizable benefit options. Again, millennials do not like to be boxed in. So they like options, they like choices, and that's essentially what's behind that particular bullet point. Millennials also like instant recognition. So they like feedback. And this is often used for reinforcement. So they want to know, am I on the right track? Am I doing this correctly? What else could I be doing? I actually personally managed a group of millennials in a sales organization just a few years ago. And when I first started, I started to get constant requests from them to meet one-on-one because they were really asking for feedback. Hey, can we go grab a coffee? Okay, how am I doing? What could I do better? And so eventually I turned that into a monthly check-in meeting with all of them because that was an obvious need that, you know, I needed to be able to meet for them. But they also like public recognition. They like team accomplishments. I kind of mentioned the collaborative thing a little bit more earlier. And when we do consulting for organizations around recognition, we say this really needs to be an all of the above strategy. Not just, so we need to train frontline supervisors on how to give feedback, how to give recognition, and make sure that that becomes kind of their regular habit. But also organizations can do other things to help augment that. As an example, we're seeing more and more interest in points programs when it comes to recognition. And a points program can be designed in a number of different ways, but it can give the employees an opportunity to give each other points so they can go redeem points for a gift or some kind of an award, so that now the company is helping promote recognition in addition to frontline supervisors, so it becomes part of the culture. So just a couple of hints there on how to meet the needs of millennials. Millennials also want to have a sense of purpose. They want to make sure that their job, yes, pay is important, but they want their life and their profession to be more than just a paycheck. They want to know that they're doing some kind of good in the world. And is what they're doing worth it? Does it make a difference to anyone other than their bank account? So sometimes when we're working with organizations around this topic, we typically kind of grab onto the Simon Sinek approach to purpose, which helps the organization move from what do we do, how do we do it, to why do we do it? And that sometimes is a difficult journey for organizations, as simple as that sounds. For example, your company might make automobiles, so that's what you do. You might do that in a factory setting, that's how you do it. But why you do it might be a little bit harder to get to, and that's what millennials want to connect to. Like, are we doing this to, you know, because we want to be the safest, you know, car company in the world, or do we want to be the most energy efficient and help, you know, have an impact on climate change, that type of thing. So they want to move to the next step of purpose and really try to connect to that. The next need we're going to talk about is financial security. So I mentioned earlier that many millennials came into the workforce during the Great Recession, at the same time being saddled with incredible amounts of student debt. So they want to find a place where they can maybe continue on their education without taking on more debt. So tuition reimbursement is important. Having some ability and some type of income to be able to pay down the existing debt that they have is also important, so they can dig out of that hole. And then even start thinking about the future when it comes to retirement. So, and then also on top of that, having some kind of incentive pay. So in addition to having a nice salary, you know, having the ability to exceed expectations and get rewarded for that is important as well. Diversity and inclusion is another topic and need that's very important to millennials. They don't want to go into a workplace where there's a very monolith culture where everybody kind of looks and acts and speaks the same. They really appreciate diversity and inclusion far more so than previous generations. And that's because they kind of grew up with that. And it's not just a matter of race or sex or sexual orientation. It's really a matter of diversity of viewpoints, appreciating people with different disabilities, being non-judgmental about those things, and having a very diverse and inclusive culture is very, very important. So if your organization has that already, promoting that out into the workplace to attract millennials could be a very, very important thing to do. this kind of overlaps with some other needs, but upward mobility, millennials they don't want to get boxed in. They don't want to feel like, oh my God, I'm going to be stuck in this job for the next 10 or 20 years. They'd like to have the opportunity to advance. Now, I will say that a lot of organizations struggle with this, in my opinion, because they get stuck into org charts. And what I would say to that is millennials don't necessarily subscribe to org charts and titles and that sort of thing. They just want opportunities to continue to do new things and to push themselves to gain experience. So, for example, sometimes we'll work with organizations to, give them some examples on like, hey, if you have an engineer that has, some desire to lead people at some point in time, you don't have to make them the manager of the engineering department right now. What you could do is say, hey, engineer, can you go lead this R&D effort for us? Or could you go lead this continuous improvement effort? And then they can gain a little bit of experience on how to influence people. They can get feedback on that experience. The organization can get a better sense of what type of leader they might be. And you can give them those types of ad hoc assignments to give them some type of experience and growth opportunity, so that you can get a little bit innovative and creative on how to make those things happen without kind of getting stuck in like, oh my God, we only have so many management positions right now. There are other creative ways to make this type of thing happen to meet the needs of millennials. So all that said, we also have to remember that in addition to the needs specific to millennials, there are drivers of engagement for all employees. So all employees, whether you're a traditionalist, a baby boomer, or a Gen X or a millennial, have needs around communication. So knowing what's going on, having communication systems set up where people can connect across boundaries, having upward communication to leadership, having those systems in place is important to everybody. Having really good performance management and employee development opportunities is important to everybody. Employees feeling like their well-being is appreciated by the company or organization is needed by everybody. Everybody's relationship with their boss is a huge driver of engagement. People don't necessarily always quit their organization, they quit their boss. And so frontline supervisor training and development is really, really important for everybody in the workplace. But kind of layering in these other items that I just mentioned, recognition is important to everybody, but instant recognition is particularly important to millennials. And then social connections are really important to everybody in the workplace. But doing that with social media and other kind of more tech savvy means is particularly important to millennials. So just kind of keeping in mind that the previous 6 items that I went through are important specific to millennials, but these are the needs for all employees that are also important. So what can you do? It might seem a little bit overwhelming sometimes okay, this is a lot of information. Now, what could I do? Here are 3 suggestions on something that you might consider. One is to ensure that your engagement strategy incorporates the needs of millennials. So I just went through all of them with flexibility, instant recognition, purpose, financial security, diversity, inclusion, and upward mobility. So you just want to make sure that your strategy on talent management and engagement, excuse me, connects to all of that. And then second, make sure that when you assess, you identify the current gaps with your employees. So you can do that through surveys, focus groups, and those types of things to make sure that that happens. And then last, make sure, I kind of just mentioned this, but make sure that you train your frontline supervisors on the needs of millennials. Certainly training them on the needs of all employees is important, but particularly on the needs of millennials is important as well. So that just might mean, do we have a good leadership development program for our frontline supervisors? Do we have good training? Is it geared toward the right things? Is the frontline supervisor performance management system set up to measure their effectiveness in the areas of meeting the needs of employees. So with that, I think I came in right at about the right time frame. I want to thank you for joining us. Again, I'm Bob Randall, and I also have this company called Transcend Engagement, where we do a lot of work around putting structures in place to help organizations improve, whether that's communications, a recognition platform, performance management. You can see it on the screen. We also do a lot of consulting and training and development with organizations as well. So if anyone has a question, you're welcome to type it into the chat box, and I'll just hang out for a minute or so. Otherwise, if you do sign out, I want to again thank you for attending today, and you'll have a follow-up email from us, and we look forward to any feedback on how we could make our next webinar even better for you. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any questions for today. So again, I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and look forward to being in touch with everybody. Thank you.